Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ronan Sen. I'm glad to have been given the opportunity of chairing this interactive session. I would like to, right at the beginning, to express my appreciation for Kiran Pasricha's initiative in holding this meeting to commemorate the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and its impact on South Asia. This is a, should I say, it remains a vitally important issue, and the terrorist outrage in Delhi just the day before yesterday highlighted its continuing importance, and also of global cooperation in combating terrorism in all its manifestations. Just to give you a before inviting the speakers, I'd just like to give you a broad overview of a personal perspective on 9/11. I happened to be in Brussels on that day. We were having this meeting of ambassadors from some European countries. I was ambassador in Germany at that time, and we had colleagues from London and from the UK, and that's Italy, Spain, and France. On that occasion, apart from our ambassador to the in Brussels, that's to the European Union. And at that time, I remember the discussions at that time this was covering a whole heap of issues on issues which were important enough to bring to the United Nations General Assembly just before the General Assembly. And in the long list, what we pointed out is that two words are missing. That's international terrorism. And the response was throughout by all in the European Union that, well, terrorism is a regional issue. It is due to regional problems which are unresolved, and you get those issues, address those problems. It is not an international issue warranting international importance. And just thereafter, during that meeting, literally on that day, I got a call from my wife to turn on the CNN. Well, the rest is history. So from not being on the agenda at all, it came right on top of the agenda. And for the first time, terrorist was equated to an act. First time in international law and history, an act of terrorism was equated to an act of war. For the first time, and so far, terrorism, this attack was, the US invoked NATO's special provision on collective self-defense. Bush described himself as a wartime president, and he declared, even in his reminiscences, just 3 days ago, I saw that in New York, that he felt that as a wartime president, because he regarded this as an act of war, that he had to go against not only the perpetrators, that's Al-Qaeda, but against those who have given safe sanctuary. I mention this because this is important. So he went against the Al-Qaeda in a relentless manner, forcibly ousted the Taliban regime from Afghanistan, gave an ultimatum to Pakistan. The second objective was weapons of mass destruction, keeping them out of the hand of terrorists, and the axis of evil, that's Iraq, Iran, North Korea. Pakistan again was a major omission because it had also acquired nuclear weapons through proliferation from China and elsewhere. The third objective was, and I mentioned this also, and just in perspective, that is not only to tackle, to address the issue of religious extremism, but also the promotion of democracy. Now, all these in their totality constituted what was known as the Bush Doctrine. In retrospect, the war on Iraq, which was based on a false premise, that was an aberration which cost us dearly, cost the United States dearly, and its standing in the global community. But the rest of it, these questions remain, and we have two eminent panelists with us today. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Praveen Swami, who is an associated editor of The Hindu and who is an authority on the subject. I would invite him to speak first, and then we have Professor Rajamohan, who will follow thereafter. But the questions is that in the sense of that where are we today, and 10 years, that's a decade later, and what is it? Are we better off today than we were at that time, where the conventional wisdom was encapsulated by the Western thinking was encapsulated not only but what we were told in Brussels on that day, on 9/11, but what was articulated by Clinton, that is the most dangerous, that is post-Kargil, that the most dangerous place in the world is a line of control on Jammu and Kashmir. And this issue should receive top consideration if you have to, deal with the challenges not only in Asia but beyond. But this was the prevalent view at that time. Since then, there has been some movement. Not all of it has been satisfactory. But are we better off today, in spite of all the mess, than we were at that time? Where are we headed? So, without further ado, I will request Mr. Praveen Sani to give us his insights, and he's a very qualified as I said, he needs no introduction, but I've read only one of his books, but I was very greatly impressed by his scholarship, and not just as an academic, but reflecting in terms of as a practitioner in diplomacy or in government. I found it a fascinating read. So I'd request him to say a few words to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Ambassador. I'm going to talk about three things, essentially. The first is about what we've actually achieved or failed to achieve in these last 10 years in terms of our concrete counter-terrorism response, and something obviously people in Delhi or elsewhere in the country have become increasingly concerned with since the tragic events of November 2008 and onwards. I'll say a little bit about what I think we've got wrong and what I think we ought to be doing. But I'm also going to try and lay out in the second part of my talk today a larger question, which is why we have a problem at all, and how little, in my view, we've done about it. Back in 10 years ago, it all seemed very, very simple. The Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, then, when he visited New York in 2002, spoke about how often he told Western diplomats that India had been at the receiving end of this terrible war, that it needed international assistance, and he expressed satisfaction that the whole world is now fighting terrorism. India is part of that struggle. I think it seemed then that this global project, this new global project that had begun, would resolve India's problems, and I think that was a terrible, terrible miscalculation. I think it failed to understand India's specific problems, and I think we're partly paying the price for that delusion. I'll try and explain why. Well, what have we got wrong? Ever since and long before 9/11, India had a jihadi terrorism problem that had cost several hundred lives. I don't count, by the way, the tragic bombings in Mumbai of 1993 as a jihadi terrorist attack. It fell within a well-established trope of communal violence. One side kills a lot of people, another side kills a lot of people. And the only difference was that one side chose to use bombs instead of knives or guns or hacksaws. It fell within a well-established trope. We had our first act of real terrorism, however, in a little later that year, on December 6, 1993, and I will come back to that shortly. What have we actually learned since Mumbai? Well, we've had this alphabet soup of new organizations. You have an NCTC, a National Counter-Terrorism Center, NatGrid, a National Terrorism Grid, a multi-agency center, MAC, you have a National Investigations Agency. So we have this plethora of acronyms, and sadly those acronyms seem to be the only thing we have in our arsenal as far as fighting terrorism goes. In concrete terms, very little has changed. Our police recruitment from the bottom up is still based on pre-independence model, which sees police forces essentially as manual laborers who can be taught a few rudimentary skills. Police in almost every state, you'll see if you look at publicly available figures, are paid on the same salary scales as unskilled labor. The same people you hire to clean your streets or run your hospitals. Quite obviously, if you have people who are hired as unskilled labor and trained as unskilled labor, you're not going to get modern scientific policing. We have had huge investments in hiring greater numbers of police personnel, which is an important thing. India now has 161 police personnel per 100,000 population roughly. If you go by 2001 census estimates, it'll look a little less nice with population ratios today. But we need figures of around 250 per 100,000 to even meet what most of our second world neighbors have. However, getting more numbers in isn't a solution to the problem. The state of Bihar, for example, has just 53 policemen per 100,000 population. The state of Nagaland has 1,650 per 100,000 population, and both are examples of incompetent and dysfunctional policing. So getting more people in isn't the problem. You need to be able to train them in actually conducting investigations, in doing intelligence work and so on, which we have no assets for. Not a single police force in this country has access, for example, to a pool of trained and educated intelligence analysts. Not Maharashtra now has an intelligence training academy, but with curriculum that is 50 years old. Even if we get all these numbers of people in, we have no national facility that will lay down standards and templates for what modern policing constitutes. There is no national document for what standards a modern police force ought aspire to meet. So essentially we have this large pool of unskilled, untrained people, which we had 10 years ago. They have new guns and new uniforms and new cars and so on, but their ability to use them still remains exactly what it was 10 years ago. And it's very, very sad, because we've had this national debate time and time and time again. Many of us hoped after 26/11 that we had a new Home Minister who seemed dynamic and serious about these things. Sadly, very, very little has changed. You just have to walk into a police station in Delhi to see how little has changed. It's particularly tragic because there's no such thing as a counter-terrorism police force. A police force that is good, for example, at implementing traffic laws or at managing the everyday business of criminal investigation will also be good at investigating terrorist crimes. The dysfunction in our criminal justice system is evident from the fact that less than 7.5% of perpetrators of serious crimes actually get convicted, which tells you something about the quality of evidence gathering and intelligence. I hear a lot of talk about special laws and how they might help fight terrorism. Under the last special law we had, the Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, the conviction rate was 1% and in some states lower. The basic point is we seem neither able to gather intelligence nor to put together evidence that will actually let us prosecute perpetrators. The sad part is this is the least of our problems. Every bomb blast that we see in the country today carries a message. It is the product of a system of ideas, of specific problems that perpetrators have. And in terms of addressing that body of grievance and resentment, we've done even less. I thought I might tell you a little bit about how this problem we call jihadi terrorism in India started. It started in 1985, really. If we're looking for a date, you can go back centuries, as Aisha Jalal's book tells us, but I'll save you the punishment of listening to lots of names. And in 1985, in Mominpura in Mumbai, which is a poor slum, a bunch of young people affiliated to the Jamiat Ahle Hadith sect, which is a new fundamentalist Islamic sect, gathered at the grounds of the Young Men's Christian Association because they were extremely upset and angry with riots taking place. They didn't actually do very much. I looked through local police station diaries to see whether anyone had even bothered to notice what they were up to, and they hadn't. And people who were around at that point say they largely paraded on the grounds of the Young Men's Christian Association in this slum, carrying lathis and preparing for self-defense drills. It was all sort of mildly farcical. But on the first anniversary of the demolition of the Babri Masjid, the members of that group carried out our first real modern jihadi terrorist attack. They bombed 7 intercity trains and carried out 43 separate explosions in Mumbai and Hyderabad. These were very low intensity, trivial blasts. Nothing very much happened. I didn't even seem to make it to the front page of national newspapers the next day. But it was the beginning of what this process we're talking about. And many of the men involved in this operation, only one of them was arrested, a Mumbai surgeon. Many of them would mentor a subsequent generation of more lethal jihadists. The organization that would carry the torch, if you like, the jihadi torch, was something called the Students' Islamic Movement of India, or SIMI, which you've all doubtless heard about. SIMI was founded in April 1977 as the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami. The Jamaat-e-Islami is, of course, South Asia's largest Islamist political grouping. It became exceptionally powerful in Pakistan and has been a flag bearer of the Islamist cause. In India, it went in a somewhat different direction. Because in the 60s, the Jamaat-e-Islami firstly realized that its dream of an Islamic state was obviously not something that was realizable in the Indian context. But in the late 60s also became concerned about communal violence and realized that it would have to make alliances with mainstream political parties to protect the interests of the people it purported to represent. Furthermore, in India, this organization never had a great deal of success because most Muslims were drawn to mainstream political groupings, in those days the Congress, subsequently other parties. In the wake of the emergency, when the Jamaat-e-Islami successfully allied with what was then the Janata Party and so on and so forth, SIMI was set up as a student body to try and speak out to this new generation of young Muslim professionals, university graduates who were starting to emerge for the first time. And it had some degree of success. At the time of its eventual proscription in 2001, had some 20,000 full-time cadre and some 4,400 sort of committed party members, which by Indian standards isn't very impressive, but nonetheless substantial. Well, who was SIMI actually speaking to? In the 80s, with the first sort of glimpses, if you like, pre-glimpses of economic liberalization, you had a large cohort of young Muslim men emerging from professional institutions and universities. The first sort of nascent middle class, Muslim middle class, if you like, which we had lost at the time of partition, people who moved from Pakistan. But this cohort of sort of lower middle class and middle class Muslim men, even though they found some economic opportunity, were very hard hit by the kinds of discrimination, social discrimination, which we are all familiar with. Many of them, for example, couldn't get housing in Hindu neighborhoods. Others felt they didn't have a fair shot at government jobs because of discrimination. And SIMI, with its angry language, SIMI basically said in its early pamphlets that it wanted an Islamic state, that no Islamic state was possible with a democratic political order, that Muslims who had embraced secularism and secular politics were destined to end up in hell. This kind of angry politics certainly appeared to some numbers of these young men. The scholar Yoginder Sikand has put it very well. It said he's written that it gave its supporters, and I quote, a sense of power and agency which they were denied in their actual lives. Very many men would go and join SIMI in their college days, give angry speeches, join up for various sort of Islamic solidarity causes, and then go away and become civil servants or run petty businesses and have nothing to do with Islamist politics. From December 1992, though, this began to change. There was, of course, a sense of shock in the Muslim community across this country as a whole. But for many young men, it appeared as if what Simi had been saying was in fact true, that the Indian state was not in fact a credible defender of their interests or of its promise of secularism and democracy. In 1996, Simi made its first public statement calling for a caliphate. It soon after put up posters, which you saw in many North Indian towns, asking young Muslims to emulate the warlord, the 11th century warlord Mahmud Ghaznavi, and fight for the demolition of temples and so on. In 2001, right after the 9/11 attacks, which brings us to why we're here, Simi activists organized demonstrations in Kanpur and Delhi, biggest in Mumbai, calling Osama bin Laden a true mujahid, a true holy warrior, and celebrating the demolition of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban. Javed Anand, the activist who's followed this group in Mumbai for a very long time, remembers seeing stickers pasted up all over Mumbai during Simi's last convention in 2001 at the Bandra Bandstand, which read, they were pasted on various Muslim shops and homes. He writes a thick red no splashed across the words democracy, nationalism, polytheism. This might seem, I think did seem to most young Muslims in this country as just talk, and not very persuasive talk at that. But it did attract some numbers of people. Early in the summer of 2004, a group of young Muslim men, in the main one-time members of Simi, gathered at a place called Jolly Beach. I love the name because what happened at Jolly Beach was so unjolly. But in the town of Bhatkal in South India, I don't know if any of you have visited Mangalore, but it's a very lovely little town just outside, a short distance from Mangalore. Beautiful beaches. It's prospered a great deal from remittances sent in from people working in the Gulf. Bhatkal itself was a historical trading port that sustained India's spice trade with West Asia once upon a time. It declined, but then these remittances really picked it up. And Jolly Beach has these fabulous sort of slightly baroque mansions running across the beach. The men who met at Jolly Beach in 2004 were the people who carried out the bomb blasts with which we became so familiar after 2005. They were almost without exceptions from the ranks of the middle class. We have this stereotype of the madrasa-educated fanatic who has a long beard, froths at the mouth while giving inflammatory speeches. None of them actually came from this class. Riaz Shahbandri, who is now fugitive in Karachi and one of the key leaders of these jihadi networks, was born to a father who had come from Bhatkal, moved to Mumbai and actually done quite well, set up a leather tanning works in Kurla. Bought a house on the Kurla Tulsi Pipe Road, which is, as those of you know the city, quite expensive area, and sent his son to computer school, to a civil engineering course. We have Altaf Subhan Qureshi, another important Indian Mujahideen leader who was a computer professional, worked executing networking projects for Wipro before suddenly drop out. Sadiq Israr Sheikh, whose parents came from a working class family in North India, migrated to Mumbai, but then saved up enough to send their son to air conditioning course. You have even more important people at the fringes of these networks. Pidikal Abdul Shibli, Yaya Kamakutti, work respectively for Tata Elxsi and Wipro General Electric. Manzoor Peerboy, who was making lakh and 10,000 back in 2008 every month, quite respectable salary. I was just looking through before I came here some data on 10 Indian Mujahideen operatives from Azamgarh, north of here, all men who are accused now, facing trial for planting bombs in Delhi in 2008. And it is quite interesting. 8 had completed a college degree. 5 were in or had completed postgraduate study. Of this group of 10, only one, Muhammad Arif Badar, had actually studied in a seminary and was a cleric of some description. And only one, Afzal Mutalib, who was not really a member of this group but a car thief who provided them cars to use, was a school dropout. So I think there you have pretty much a snapshot of who this class of jihadi is. Certainly not poor people, certainly not members of India's vast underprivileged Muslim class, but people who've done well. It's very hard to make a sense of what actually drove these people, but when you talk to them, they say two things. Most of them actually departed for training, or certainly the leadership who we now know departed for training at Lashkar-e-Taiba camps and Jaish-e-Mohammed camps in Pakistan around 2001. around the time of 9/11. Um, there was a spurt in recruitment after the terrible violence in Gujarat in 2002. But the process of recruitment for armed acts certainly began a little before that. And when you speak to them, all of them speak of communal violence and their need to do something about it. Many of them also speak of a sense of being completely cut off from this sort of larger Indian society. Yahya Kamakutti and Pedikal Shibli, the two computer engineers in Bangalore who I spoke to you about, actually met at a little hostel run for North Kerala Muslims in Bangalore called Sarani, because they had trouble getting housing, being Muslim. You will find this as a common trait with the North Indian jihadists as well. Many of them live, for example, in Jamia Nagar, not because they thought it was a wonderful area, but because it was the only place where they could really find homes, and ended up creating these little closed bubble groups of people whose ideas reinforced each other. This sadly hasn't changed at all in the 10 years since 9/11. 9/11 or terrorism was never understood as something which has a genesis in specific social conditions. Please note I'm not using the phrase root cause. I think that's a meaningless notion, but we can discuss that later. But has its genesis in specific social conditions that need addressing. These young Muslims, like Islamists elsewhere in the world, came from a class which had found economic opportunity but had no political voice, had no real political representatives, and felt disenfranchised socially and politically, and in jihadist polemic found a voice. What do I think we should do about it? Well, I'll just end here and we can perhaps discuss this later, but I think our key failure since 9/11 has been twofold, two key failures. The first, of course, has been to build effective policing and intelligence. We've had all these top-down sort of initiatives which look nice, but rest on the, I think, unfounded assumption that there's some sort of quick technical fix that will sort out our policing and intelligence system. There isn't, and I think that's become abundantly clear over the last 2 years. There's a larger failure also, though, which is the inability to have an honest national conversation about communalism, its costs and its consequences. We're a quite exceptional society. I think we have a national credo that holds that our culture is exceptional in its tolerance. But we like to pretend that that very culture has also been the cause or generated unimaginable violence over many decades, even before independence, which we have rarely talked about. In the liberal rendition of events, Muslims are victims of a betrayal of our syncretic values. In the right-wing Hindu nationalist account, Muslims are villains who betrayed it. But either way, it means that we have a politics that either panders to Islamism and religious fundamentalism or demonizes Muslims. We have no constructive engagement at all. At the level of culture as well, we rarely bring things that are talked about in most middle-class homes in this country, in Hindu homes or in Muslim homes, to the level of public debate. And in most people's homes, I think you will know this from your own experience, the narrative that goes on has very little to do with what is said publicly. There are fears, suspicions, angers, resentments, which are rarely voiced by our politicians or our leaders and talked about. There is instead this veil of self-deceit. I cannot think of a liberal, or I can think of very few Indian liberal middle-class families where children marrying across religious lines, for example, would even today not be the subject of enormous disputation. And great numbers of homes, both Hindu and Muslim, who would consider twice before renting properties to people on the other side. The patterns of business ownership, again, I wish there was a survey on it, I think will show enormous reliance on caste and religious networks for hiring rather than on merit. Put simply, in this last decade, even though we've become increasingly adept at adopting technological modernity, our culture itself is yet to modernize and secularize, and there is a profound failing, I think, of our politics. We have politicians who will not speak this language, or leaders who will not speak this language. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh spoke when he took office of the need to ensure, and I quote, that painful incidents like the 1984 anti-Sikh massacres and the Gujarat riots never happen again. He's gone some way, I think, and we've gone some way in these 10 years as a country to making sure that it doesn't. I think it will be an ill-placed, an ill-advised politician or a police officer who will go along with the kinds of things that happened in Gujarat. But stopping riots itself is not a solution to this problem. We not only need to work on our policing, but also introspect upon our culture and our social fabric, and reflect on what we need to do in order to make sure that this long war our Prime Minister speaks of does not stretch into being an interminable and unending one. Thank you.
I should now request Professor Rajan. I'm sure a number of you are read his article today, but I request you to give him a very careful listening, because he has got a lot to say and a lot of experience, not just in the subcontinent but globally on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Sen. What I'll do is, try to complement what Praveen has done so brilliantly in the last few minutes, which is to paint the challenging picture at home in dealing with the question of terrorism and how it has evolved over the last few years. What I thought I'll do is really look at the big political strategic picture outside India in terms of how that affects since 9/11. For lack of a better term, we can call it a tale of four cities. The four cities being Washington, Rawalpindi, Kabul and Delhi. How this dynamic post 9/11 dynamic has worked in each of these places, whether they've gained or lost, and where the future beckons them in the next decade after 9/11. First, I think we have to start from Washington. The reaction of President Bush, the furious, massive reaction, as Ambassador Sen pointed out, declaring himself a wartime president, and the very term war on terrorism that was used. That today, if you look at any American paper in the last few days, the big debate on whether Bush overreacted, whether that was the right thing to do, whether actually the reaction of the United States complicated the problem. But of course, the debate is along fairly predictable lines, within the US. But it's a very, very interesting debate. It's also important, I think, to recall that many Americans actually criticized the use of the term war on terrorism. Terrorism is a means. The use of violence against innocent people who have nothing to do with your immediate dispute or grouse, that using violence against innocent people in the pursuit of a political cause. So terrorism is a tactic. It's a stratagem. It's not, you can't fight a war against a tactic or a strategy that it is not an ideology in itself, that there was something else beneath that. So therefore, this idea that you have to do a war on terrorism, in fact, it got another alphabet soup that time, GWOT, Great War on Terror. So that was with all the industry of counter-terror industry that grew post 9/11. At great debates on this. So the very conception that Bush outlined was challenged by many in the United States. And today, interesting, ever since the Obama administration came to power, the term war on terror has simply disappeared. In fact, Obama uses the term the challenge of violent extremism. It's not as simple like, Democrats are always more complex. But the fact is that the struggle against violent extremism is a deliberate political attempt to pull away from this notion of war on terror. So the divide within the US was pretty deep in terms of how to react and how to deal with this new challenge. US also debated as the homeland security, because US was attacked for the first time after 1812, not counting Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was actually quite far away. That 1812, the Brits went and burned down Washington. After that, US homeland was not attacked. So for the first time, most of us who lived in Europe or Asia understand when there is a security threat, how that affects the state and how the state treats its citizens. The question of civil rights versus security state. That tension which most European states, have gone through it at some point or the other. But for the Americans, for the first time, in dealing with the new challenge and framed in terms of the homeland security, what is the relationship between protecting the US against terrorists while not violating their fundamental rights? In the US there is a strong movement has always been a consistent defense of individual interests. So for the first time, you saw in the debate on the Patriot Act, people raising questions that is the right way to go. And then you saw the debate on the rendition, Guantanamo, how the US ought to treat those who were taken as terrorists. So we've seen a very interesting political debate within the US. And I think once Obama came, and I think many of the assumptions that were made under Bush have largely been discarded, but not entirely. I mean, Obama promised he'll shut down Guantanamo. He's not been able to. So he also had to, while not as is a peace president, he's got a Nobel Peace Prize in his first year. But even then, I mean, it's not been easy to get rid of institutional arrangements that came up during the Bush period. Far more interesting, I think, if you look at the last decade, that we see when 9/11 happened, a lot of people said, look, this is a fundamental change. Is it a change in the structure of international politics? A small, organized groups, what they can do to the international system, that you didn't need, all you needed, you had access to technology and the existence of a complex, interdependent urban world as well as an interconnected global world, say the airline system, that is so easy to attack these things. So therefore, the idea that has this changed the fundamentals of world politics, that was a big question that was raised. Many of us had argued at the time, look, terrorism, while all this is true, that non-state actors have gained quite a bit of clout, this does not amount to any fundamental structural change. In fact, the terrorists have thrived when there was state support for it. And once you drain them of the state support, that it's not been easy for them to operate. So, but what's changed, in fact, interestingly, while US has broadly kind of got some upper hand over the Al-Qaeda in a general sense, what we see happen at the end of the decade is this huge structural change. That the relative decline of the United States, today the widespread perception of the US decline. Just a decade later, if you go back to 9/11, the big debate was about American unilateralism, the ferociousness of the American response, and how everyone in the world, anybody who was a liberal, any liberal worth his salt would say, look, this is all very, very bad for the world. But a decade later, we're arguing about American weakness, not American strength. Oil was $28 a barrel, September 1st, 2001. Today is what, 100 plus. America had a surplus in September 2001. Clinton had left a nice budget surplus. The American economy was going at 3 to 4% at extraordinary speeds. So everything looked underlining the extraordinary success of the United States. But a decade later, you have today looking at the American weakness. And this weakness has not come from the war on terror, in a sense, what US did in Afghanistan or Iraq, but the financial crisis that came. Today is posing very serious structural questions to how the US thinks about the world, and in turn has an effect on what the US is going to do in Afghanistan. That the exhaustion from the military was an important burden, but the change in the economic structure and the economic crisis that came in 2007 has left the US in a very, very different position. And I think that some of that is going to drive how the US ends this war. That the questions of whether the US can afford it or not is a big debate in the United States today. So I keep saying it's not the warlords in Washington who are going to decide on the war, but it's the warlords in Washington who, the political divide in Washington, the competing groups within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, who are going to define what the US is going to do. And that this shift from the fear of American dominance today to the recognition of American weakness is also reflected in what the US set out to achieve in Afghanistan, and most probably what it does when it leaves. This idea that, look, you've got to defeat the Al-Qaeda. Americans are claiming big success, but it's not clear whether they've actually defeated Al-Qaeda, but they've certainly stopped attacks. The idea of building a new nation in Afghanistan. Today, nation building, even within the Democratic Party, which otherwise the liberals are great champions of nation building. Today, Obama, every time he makes a speech, he's saying, look, we must build our nation at home. So he's posing this idea of nation building within the United States, in contrast to this argument, the great liberal argument of the 90s and the 2000s, that look, how far should the US go in building other richer societies? So that's clearly off even for the liberals, and notwithstanding Libya. So the idea that you can do nation building is gone. More fundamentally, I think the the idea that you can leave Afghanistan in a stable position. So we're not talking about, all politicians, you have to change the definition of victory. When you start out with something, you have to change the definition when you declare victory and get out. And what is being defined today as victory is fairly slim. And it's not clear when the US leaves or when the US ends its combat role in 2014, there will be anything that can be defined as a victory. What we don't know, of course, at this stage is what we know at this stage is US strength in Afghanistan is going to come down significantly. That by 2014, the troops will be substantially reduced. What is not clear at this stage is what will be left in Afghanistan. Will it be what size of force? What is the duration? How long will they stay? What is the kind of roles they're going to take? Training? Or will they keep the nice little base to keep bombing Pakistan or not? But the fact is, the nature of the military presence, that's being negotiated with between Kabul and Washington, and we'll see how far that will go. But by the end of this decade, it's quite clear for most of us who argued in the last decade about American unilateralism and American power, we will have to face a new situation where an American retreat in relative decline is going to produce outcomes which are going to be far more difficult to deal with. It's always good to have a strong hegemon who does all the dirty work and also gets all the abuse. But when the hegemon leaves, we're going to see kind of games that are going to be played in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the next decade, which are going to be very different. And they won't be the Americans to blame. Of course, you can always find the Americans to blame for some things. But at the end of it, you're going to find a much more complex picture here, where the challenge of dealing with American retreat is going to be far more difficult than the arguments about American hegemony in the last 10 years. So I think that's the story of Washington, and we see how that plays out. The second story of Kabul, I think Kabul welcomed the fall of the Taliban. It just took, not even 5,000 American troops. The Northern Alliance just rolled down. People welcomed the invaders, the so-called foreigners, with great arms. But a decade later, there's clearly an exhaustion in terms of how this war has played itself out. Because no foreigners are going to be welcome for too long. So it's quite clear, while many Afghans want the international community to stay as long as they could help them to build a state, it's also quite clear the longer they stay, there's going to be more problems. So it is not whether you're pro-Taliban or anti-Taliban, but the question of how do you deal with this external invasion, which has not succeeded. I think if you had succeeded in a sense for the Afghans, quickly, decisively, it would have been all right. But a decade later, the Afghans find themselves in this terrible situation. They were promised in 2001, this time we're not going to let you down. This time we won't betray you, which is what the West did in 1988 when the Soviets left, said goodbye, went back, allowed the creation of the Taliban. All the muck that we have today was largely the consequence of what the international jihad against the godless communists that the Reagan administration promoted. Brilliantly successful, but the backlash is what you're dealing with. So for the Afghans, it's going to be a great tragedy to deal with the unfolding situation, where the idea that you could build a reasonably stable government, that doesn't look too clear at this point. While everyone wants to talk to the Taliban, nobody knows who actually talk to. So you're going to have a very confused situation that it is not clear Kabul will be stable in 2014. Because the American deadline seems pretty serious, and I don't see how this president is going to alter it or the next one. But so you're going to see, from Kabul's perspective, a completely difficult, and whatever the expectations were of the international system, much of that stands belied. And what you have, I think part of the problem is, today 90% of the Afghan economy comes from outside aid. This international, the invasion of the non-governmental organizations, all this do-gooding Western groups, that somebody does gender, somebody does drugs, somebody does the single-issue groups which have taken over this place. But at the end of it, they're not going to leave much. That the people can say, look, we can handle this. Afghanistan has the resources now, as we discover. It has oil, it has gold, it has huge amount of resources. But the question of translating that into economic growth, internally sustainable economic growth, that's going to be pretty hard. And how we do that? Whether even we've not done, India's done a few projects on the agriculture, even regenerating agriculture, or using Afghanistan's position as a transit point. Well, all of us talk about it. If security situation falls apart, you're going to have a terrible situation out there, and it's not. No one is going to bet that the current regime, the current situation is going to hold. And the tragedy of it is, of course, the only thing Afghans have done for the last since the late 1970s is to fight. All Afghan men know how to fight from their childhood. Yet we have the Germans trying to organize an army for them, and you can't get an ANA up and running that can stand. And even if you create on the present lines an ANA, whether it can be financed through internal resources is absolutely clear. It can't be financed because Afghanistan doesn't generate the resources to sustain an army. So what you have is the only thing good they've been at, even that the international community could not organize as a way of saying, look, take on these situations. And then the whole internal fault lines, how they're going to play out, that's a big story. The third city we talk about is Rawalpindi. On 10/11, that is, sorry, what is it, 9/10, sorry, yeah, the American style, 9/10, on September 10th, Pakistan Army was in the doghouse. It was written off when Musharraf had done his coup. People are saying, look, no coup is a good coup. In fact, it was only Mr. Vajpayee, we invited him here and made him a president because he couldn't come here as the chief executive officer of Pakistan, which is what was his title. So the moment we invited him, he said, look, I want a state visit, and we made him president of Pakistan. That he was in the, I'm talking about July 2001, that the Pakistan Army was in the doghouse. And we had the initial contacts between India and the United States in 2001 January, but that, look, these guys are finished. There's no hope in hell for Pakistan. It's a failed state. There's the problem of nuclear weapons, but no, we're going to do things differently. We're going to have a new partnership and forget Pakistan. In fact, on September first week, the Washington was beginning to take this legislation to do a whole lot of things that would have elevated India with a bigger picture of Asia, etc. Now, as luck would have it for Musharraf, I mean, Pakistan is one which benefited in a very narrow sense for the army at least, that just as the Russian invasion of Afghanistan saved General Zia-ul Haq, the 9/11 saved Musharraf and the Pakistan army. From being an untouchable, was not willing to be received anywhere, the Commonwealth had expelled them, suddenly Musharraf becomes the front, Pakistan army becomes the front line, the most wanted ally of the United States. What was a major non-NATO ally, they were given the status. That Pakistan, from being in the doghouse, was now in the clubhouse. That it would have a significant say in how the organization and conduct of the Afghan operations will go. And therein lay the tragedy of the US policy as well, and for the region. That moment the US had no choice but to depend on the Pakistan Army and the ISI to do what it wants to do in Afghanistan. But the moment you gave them that role, it was impossible to actually clean your own instrument, because it was a tainted instrument, but because you needed them, you could not organize policies to make Pakistan abandon its commitment to terrorism. So therefore, you're caught in this situation, and I think much of the 2000s for the United States was how to manage this complex relationship. You knew very clearly Pakistan was part of the problem, but Pakistan was also defined as part of the solution. And it's not Indian quarreling with the American policy, but I think it's inherent in the structure, that for geography demanded Pakistan. Geography, intelligence demanded ISI, so you didn't have much of a choice. But it is that tussle that went on throughout the 2000s, of how do you, even as the US steadily came to know Pakistan Army was playing both sides of the street, it took well into the Obama administration, Obama said, look, Bush fought the wrong war, the war of the choice in Iraq, but it is a war of necessity in Afghanistan. We're going to confront wherever the sources of terrorism are, and that's when you see the drone attacks mount under Obama administration. But even after knowing that today, it's still not possible for the two of them to divorce each other. Because even if the Americans want an exit, I mean, you still need the safe passage to be organized by someone. First, probably the Pakistan Army has to do it. So whichever way whatever you want to do there, you still have the problem of Pakistan. And there I think the Pakistanis are going to leverage that fully and efficiently, and the country might go to dogs, but then they're not standing for elections. So all the people who talk about Pakistan is going down the tubes. Look, when did that bother the army? They have the control of the national resources. They can put the civilians one against the other. So this idea that somehow there is an enlightened collective rationality for Pakistan. I think is a mistake. There's only enlightened self-interest of the Pakistan army. So therefore, in the coming years, and I think if you saw the story the New York Times and various other papers did, April 16th, 3 weeks before Osama got raided, you had Mr. Gilani, the Prime Minister, Mr. Kayani, the Army Chief, Mr. Shuja Pasha, the ISI Chief, the Defense Minister, the Foreign Minister, you had the whole Pulton, as we say in India, got into a plane, told Hamid Karzai, look, America is going downhill. China is the rising star. Let's do a deal. Let's get the Chinese in, and that's going to be the future. And it was pretty brazen that it was said across the table in a meeting. And the piece of paper was read out by Mr. Gilani to Mr. Hamid Karzai of what they would like to see. We're going to help you. We won't hang you up on a lamppost like we did to Najibullah, provided you do the following. This is just 3 weeks before. And I see all that happened since the raid on bin Laden. That fundamental thing has not changed. In a sense, there's nothing to suggest in the Pakistan army today that they're ready to change the course and ready to help the United States to fight the battle. So therefore, what the army does in Pakistan, we might think Pakistan is in a bad shape. The Pakistan army thinks there is a historic moment here to regain strategic depth in Afghanistan, and that there is a moment that they're going to play, having invested 30 years of effort into it. There's nothing to suggest you can pull back. No gambler can pull back. You've got to go full and broke into the situation most probably they're going to do. So where does that leave us, India? And I think in a final set of ideas. I mean, that we had, as I wrote today, I mean, I think the 9/11 gave us hope. What the Ambassador Sen said and what Praveen said, look, we could work together with the international system. That finally the scale and scope of the attack was so big that it's inevitable that the response of the United States and the West would be to clean up Pakistan's act, and we finally will get someone to help us out in dealing with our problem. I think that was pretty quickly disabused. We were disabused pretty quickly, and that it was going to be a far more complex thing given the Western dependence on Pakistan. But at the same period, we saw extraordinary transformation of India-US relations. What Bush did for us was two things. One, he took off the nuclear issue off the agenda, which has been a big, for 40 years we've argued with the Americans. Then, even more important, because acts of omission are not always appreciated, that the refusal of the Bush administration to peddle the Kashmir question was a big favor for India, because we don't acknowledge it publicly, or since they didn't claim credit for it. But the fact that for 10 years before, under the Clinton administration, we had daily argument on Kashmir. The moment Bush came and said, look, I'm not going to interject myself into this. These guys want to solve it, it's your problem. So, the two big favors it did. But when it came to terrorism, there were limits to what the US could do. There was, till 2001 September, they were not willing to even acknowledge there were sources of terrorism in Pakistan, anti-India terror in Pakistan. And slowly we saw bit by bit putting some of these organizations under the list. And 2008 Bombay attacks, of course, expanded dramatically the cooperation. But yet, the ability for two of us to work together is still constrained by American interests in Pakistan. And that constraint is something we still have to deal with. But in terms of Afghanistan itself, the US has been very welcoming of India's economic role, but it doesn't want too much of military role for India. So therefore, the dehyphenation worked for us on the basic question of improving India-US relations, but when it came to terrorism, we couldn't go very far. And then when we couldn't get it done through the Americans, of course, we tried to negotiate with Pakistan, actually on the Kashmir question. Some of the WikiLeaks have told you a little bit about it, but it was pretty open secret that there was actually a serious negotiation in the back channel. There was a piece of paper that was produced, and I think it was intellectually quite innovative in terms of how we tried to solve the problem of Kashmir between Musharraf and Manmohan Singh. But the day Musharraf was gone, Kayani starts all over again. And that also fits into a nice pattern between India and Pakistan. What we negotiate with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is not acceptable to Ziaul Haq. What we negotiate with Ziaul Haq is not acceptable to his successor. What we do with Nawaz Sharif is not acceptable to Musharraf. What we do with Musharraf is not acceptable to Kayani. So therefore we're back in square one. And the fact is, even if you look back at the 10 years, if the US couldn't buy Pakistani support or coerce Pakistan into supporting on the war on terror, I think India has no hope in hell that we can get it on a piece of paper in a negotiation sitting across the table. So I think that leaves us in a very completely different situation. So as the US leaves, as Pakistan's prospect for influencing developments in Afghanistan increases, I think India is going to face a completely different decade. And this decade is going to be very different from the last decade. The last decade, whatever the faults of Bush were, the American strong international presence gave us some space, gave us some time. Now, as the US leaves, it's going to be far more difficult for India I'm saying difficult it is. The question is, we need new policies, new ways of looking at the region. And there, I think the challenge is for us how we think about the internal situation in Afghanistan, how we think about Pakistan, how we think about the international system. Because all these years, there are a lot of Indians who said, look, don't be seen with the Americans. The Americans are not going to be around to be seen very much with. If that is the situation, if the Chinese take a bigger role in Afghanistan, if Pakistan has a bigger role in Afghanistan, we're talking about a completely different geopolitical situation. And that there's no guarantees at all that the external support that we had in the last 10 years, what little it was, can only decline. So we are in uncharted waters. We are in a new phase of the great game, because the world is not going to come to an end just because the Americans leave Afghanistan. From Alexander the Great, the number of people who came and left is countless. One more story, one more chapter. But we're going to be around. We've got to deal with what exists. And that is going to be even more complex, more interesting story for the next 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Raja. We've had two excellent presentations, and I'm afraid there's very little time for the interaction. But I just would like to perhaps give just one or two clarifications. One is that I hope there will be a discussion, since we are discussing the South Asia, and I'm glad that Raja, you brought in China, because that's a very important factor when you're talking about South Asia. We are focused a lot on these four capitals. We are focused on Delhi, but there also has been, apart from the nuclear deal, and apart from J&K being taken off the agenda, and deliberately by Bush, it was sought to be reintroduced but dismissed very quickly by Obama, and as counterproductive. But there was a third factor. The third factor was India's position, not just in South Asia, actively promoting that, but India's position in Asia. And in this context, irrespective of 9/11, proceeding in parallel, very close consultations on every step which the United States took with respect to other neighbors, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Bangladesh. Let's not forget, for instance, where the Indian Airlines flight which landed up in Afghanistan, where it originated from. It originated from Kathmandu. You had the ISI presence in Terai for a long time. Of course, we have to focus primarily on the West, but there was a lot of elements over there. In Bangladesh, I'm sorry that the visit didn't work out as well as we expected, the recent visit of our Prime Minister, because it's a worrisome trend, apart from what has been pointed out, very worrisome trend that we don't have a broader agenda in the interests of the compulsion of coalition politics, of the larger agenda. That is, you can't separate these. We need cooperation from Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, what's happening in Sri Lanka, these are going to, all these, we have had the process of very close consultations, then on China, then broaden on to in the East Asia, Southeast Asia, the tsunami. Then also another factor I just like to point out is that there was not total cohesion in the Bush administration. You had Powell, who had a certain view. You had the neocons, Cheney, Rumsfeld and others. And mind you, they were not, I repeat, that's the second thing I just want to clarify, that we constantly harp on the subject of the US reluctance to give India a military role that is self-imposed. They were not at all opposed to it. Quite the contrary. So let's get that out of the way. With these two broad issues, I just want to mention, and maybe either Raja or you, Swami, if you could, Praveen, would you like to react to that, and then we can get on to some other issues?
It's quite interesting, I think, what you said about the U.S., the Bush administration's interest in a more security role of India. And I think, but the general impression, at least outside, was that they were conveying at least the Pakistani concerns about Indian consulates, and that was the general, at least in the public domain, that was the.
Yeah. In fact, it was quite the contrary. And Bush had confronted Musharraf repeatedly, and Musharraf actually on 2 occasions lost his temper. But anyway, I'd like to, another aspect I'd just like to mention in passing is that we also have a situation which is, there's also belief that now, you see, we were worried about the Americans when they were on the ascendant, and there was a lot of criticism of the NDA government also when it sought to align itself very closely, reference to US and India being natural allies, references to the collaboration after 9/11, not just terrorism and in our region, but also in Iraq, operationally, with our operational presence. It's a different matter that we had second thoughts about it. We had initial concerns about out-of-station NATO operation, at least what seemed to be, I deliberately say, what seemed to be, or seems to be, this, the Arabs, what they dubbed as the Arab Spring. I don't know what it ultimately will become, but to deal with what was promoted by the neocons and adopted by Bush, the democracy agenda, where the US was in a peculiar position of, in this strange oxymoron, leading from behind. I would request the members of this very distinguished audience, if you have some comments, additional observations or questions to the 2 distinguished panelists. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Is there a mic around so that everyone can hear?
My name is Sheila Bhatt. I'm from Rediff.com. Ambassador Sen, I wanted to ask you that Raja said this about 4 capitals, but how do you see after 9/11 how China has played up? What was the China's approach to the entire this great event of 9/11, and how they have played up their role in international diplomacy? Do you think that because of 9/11 China's presence or prominence has accelerated because America got engaged in the war on terror? Can you explain that?
I think
Raja, you can also after that,
please.
after Ambassador Sen.
No, I think I think I'll leave it to Raja.
So Indian Express carried by Min-Shin Pei, he's a well-known Chinese scholar in the US, that it is the golden decade for China. That while China's reform started in 78, growth 80s, 90s, but the 2000s provided that final takeoff where they emerge as now most probably the strongest economy in the not too distant future. In fact, most Chinese are quite thankful for 9/11 because if you look at the first 6 months of the Bush administration, they came with the clear thing saying that, look, the challenge is going to be China, Asia is where they're going to focus, you needed to build a new coalition to deal with the rise of China. But 9/11 first took them to Afghanistan and then to Iraq. So the preoccupation in the Middle East actually gave the Chinese that room to, and the Americans needed Chinese support as well. to deal with other, various issues in the UN Security Council. So I think it provided Chinese just the right break where they could consolidate themselves. So I think the Chinese have done remarkably well in the last decade. And I think the consequence of that we'll see in the next.
Mr. Swami, you have anything to add to that?
Just a very brief point that in terms of just our security architecture, we don't seem to have even the building blocks of one. I know Raja has been deeply concerned about this over years, but on Central Asia, on China, we have a diminishing body of expertise which has become smaller. I mean, whatever you say about Bush, at least he invested in language schools and centers of excellence and so on. We have none. I've always found it very interesting that I can go to a US Defense Department website and look up jihadi pamphlets and tracts in perfect translation a week after they appear. There is nowhere in India I can do that. And even our knowledge on Pakistan, in terms of actual area knowledge, is diminishing very rapidly.
Yes, please.
My question is to Mr. Praveen Swami. You had mentioned about, some kind of social injustice or some kind of disengagement with the mainstream activities by certain groups. There is always some kind of dissent or inequality in the certain communities, and which has led to some kind of terrorism. And that is true not just in case of the jihadi terrorism, that would be true for any terrorism. I've been very closely affected by the terrorism in Punjab as well. And they have also used a similar argument, there is inequality and there is no involvement in the mainstream, etc. Now, one is the treatment at the political level, another is at the social level, and also to some extent at what kind of attitude you have or what kind of philosophical level, and any comments on that. And many times, we say, okay, there is only political administrative treatment, and we tend to forget about the other aspect, which is social, much softer, philosophical, or maybe the spiritual part. Thank you.
I'll steer clear of any spiritual stuff. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think in this country we have a genuine social malaise, and maybe it's an extreme representation, but we have a strangely apartheid society where religious communities in particular and caste groups in particular simply do not interact with each other in any kind of meaningful way. This is a real problem, and if there was one lesson to be learnt in 1992, let alone 2001, it was the need to do something about this. Unlike the United States, we were not being attacked from outside but from within, and this was a key distinction which was never quite engaged with or understood.
Yes.
As rightly pointed out, there is a social problem, other thing, and that will be in all societies, all countries. Everyone has got disparity and things like that. And somehow if you analyze all these attacks which have taken place, they've been very simple to diffuse, to deter with, provided our security forces are alert. I am from defense, ex-defense. I've interacted with DGPs, I've interacted with CISF DGs for airport security, I've interacted with RAW, I've interacted with a lot of people. I won't give my sorry statement. Only thing I will say, what has happened in Delhi High Court. Anyone who's in charge of that particular area, what drill they follow? Officers, they come, police officers, they come at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, they just sit down. Constable, they sit down next to tea shop. What drill they follow? What's the SOP they do? Even in Supreme Court, this sort of attitude is there. I interacted with Supreme Court in 2007 to enhance their security. It was one of my job. I interacted with the senior most police official who's in charge. He shunted me to the administrative in charge. He again sent me to the Chief Justice. Letters and all that. Nothing happened. Finally, the chief police officer there, he tells me, Colonel Saab, you are wasting your time here. No one is interested in CCTV here because The advocates who are functioning, they are very strong. If CCTVs are there, their nexus with the criminals, their other activities will get exposed. This is the state of affair of security of Supreme Court. Why I got driven towards Supreme Court was because there was an important trial going on. There were a lot of banners, trial of such and such person. Look, something may happen. I told my boss that I will go and wake them up. So this is the thing. Delhi High Court also is well known. So the requirement is this: our police force should wake up. They should follow the normal simple drills of security, checks and monitor, not sit down. Even the dog squad which is there, you will find everywhere, the dog is standing next to the tea stall and eating biscuits. They are detraining the dog, not training. You will never see a dog in the coaches at various places, the constable who takes. You will always find, mind, you keep on observing. So this is a state of affair, how, I mean, any social discord or anything, anyone can take advantage. It's good thing, this is our good luck, that they are not taking much advantage over these sort of things.
Any reaction? Yes, sorry. Just excuse.
Except that I think dogs are entitled to biscuits.
Yeah. Let the gentleman. Yeah. Please.
After any major terrorist strike, there are two set of words which are very often repeated. One is terrorism as an instrument of state policy, and number two, Pakistan being the epicenter of terrorism. How much of truth do you see in this, number one? Number two, how much of this related to Pakistan's new friendship with China has got to do with the perceived affluence and the economic growth of India?
Yes, I mean,
Indian state doesn't seem to have an effective counter-terror policy. Pakistan seems to have an effective terror policy to pursue the interests of the state. So I think we are nicely, symmetrical in a very basic sense. Look, I don't think China has anything to do with this. I mean, I think you should keep the Chinese out. The use of terrorism as a state policy was invented in Afghanistan. That it was the US, Saudi Arabia, the entire West, and Pakistan, when they decided to, the bear was trapped in Afghanistan, the bear had to be bled and killed. So the jihad was launched. You remember in the 80s, when we was just new journalists, any American visiting congressman would go to Peshawar, stand next to the long beards, say, look, it's a freedom, survive the savage kind of thing. I mean, the greatest. And then we had all the Western governments here, all embassies used to brief the Western correspondents. What were this week's results in Afghanistan? So it was used, everyone thought it was a brilliant idea to fix the Russians. And the Russians were fixed. But then the people who were used, they had their own agenda. The Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba were all consequence of the jihad. So today the challenge is, it's not because India is surviving. I think some people argue because the gap between India and Pakistan is increasing, not about wealth. That as India continues to grow, the strategic gap will expand. Therefore, Pakistan is never going to give up the terror instrument because that's one way it can keep up India. So therefore, it is a strategic necessity.
Mr. Praveen?
I just go a little further and say that Pakistan's use of sponsorship of terrorism isn't new. It dates back to 47. You can find cases from 51 going on to 65 where they were doing this in Kashmir. And Pakistan is hardly unique in this, as you pointed out. And there are dozens of other nation states. Both the great superpowers, after all, constantly played this game.
We did our bit in LTT.
We did our bit in the LTT, and we did our bit in Bangladesh. And Pakistan is... someone or the other, terrorism is a military tactic. It is a means of exerting power and influence in a situation where you don't have the conventional military instruments to do so. In the real world, there is absolutely no point complaining that your neighbor is doing something bad. You need to think about building your own walls high enough that you are not affected by whatever your neighbor is up to. There's no doubt that Pakistan funds, trains, provides shelter to terrorists active in India today, not just jihadi terrorists, but other groups too. The question is, are we going to sit around lamenting this or hope that the Americans are going to come and solve our problems for us? Or do what we need to do in order to address this problem? And aside than lamentation, I don't see that we have very much.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Raja, it has been already established that terrorism is its industry itself, and the way you pointed out 4 cities or 4 countries are the major victims, and China has never been a victim. I think they are the major beneficiaries. To what extent China is gaining out of this terrorism industry?
Too in Xinjiang, but they got enough influence in Pakistan to be able to deal with it on a bilateral basis. And they say the friendship is deeper than the oceans and higher than the mountains. So they got a strategic partnership. So I think they manage it within that. The industry is not, terror groups have grown. The industry I was talking about was the counter-terror industry, that a whole group of people who are studying this, following this, the number of security guards we have. I mean, you could walk into Delhi, any government office, without going through a metal detector 10 years ago, but today you can't. So that's the industry I was talking to. But I don't see the Chinese as part of this problem. Chinese might not join the Americans or the Indians in criticizing Pakistan because they want to keep the relationship, but they're not the source of the problem.
Yes.
Sir, I would like to take this from where Mr. Praveen Swami left. Actually, in the end, he said that there are 2 issues to it. One, that on the intelligence part, on the policing defense-related issue, and the second thing he took up was the cultural aspect, where there's one community, specific community, which is feeling culturally, politically isolated. Right? I guess that's where he left. Right? So let's say if we the first perspective, and India also goes on investing into this defense policing thing, are we not just going to follow USA the way, whatever Sir said in the beginning? 2001, till 2001, US complete focus was only almost on economic development. In the last 1 decade, has been only on defense and strategic issues. That actually deviated it from that course, and the result is what we are seeing in the form of 2007 economic downturn and the present status. And this eventually is going to lead USA probably, into a spiral kind of a thing which will take it economically down. One. So probably shouldn't we learn a lesson from there that, just policing and defense thing is not going to be the solution to this problem? One thing. The second part is, and on this also I would like to have your comment, is that when you said cultural isolation, don't you see that the problem lies into that larger canvas, which is painted by politics and, probably drawn by politics and media almost painting it, and then that is what we see, and it reflects culturally into the isolation that we see at the, base level. That probably whatever differences we are having with that other community and community differences that we are finding is basically just reflected or coming up because what media is painting. The way we see every time, so just 1 second. I'm just winding up these things, in case you allow me, just 1 more minute. So what I feel is that probably the problem, and I would like your answer on this, the problem is the way media is painting it. Every time there is a bomb blast, we see it on the first page, and the whole nation comes to see it, and then the difference starts creating. You start building up that problem against that community, right? So shouldn't we see something, probably that larger thing and electoral reforms, so that we can set up a better platform, that larger canvas itself is better painted?
Yeah.
I don't think the media is the problem. I mean, if there's a bomb blast in Delhi, we can't not very well put it on the front page. And fortunately, we have politicians who give us lots of other things to put on the front page most often. I think, and maybe I'll make myself unpopular for saying this, but I think European and American society have been far better equipped to deal with this challenge than we have in some ways. In spite of the terrible provocations of 9/11 or what happened in the London Underground 13/7, you have not had large-scale ethnic or religious violence or so on of the kinds we have periodically inflicted upon ourselves. The standard sort of narrative you have in India of this is that you have some evil politicians who are going out and making people do bad things. But I think there is a much deeper cultural dysfunction. I've reported on communal riots over the years And while yes, politicians provoke and try and capitalize on these things, nobody makes anyone go out and butcher their neighbors. Many of you were around in Delhi in 1984. The Congress party may have done whatever it did, but the killing was done by perfectly nice, ordinary people for reasons which are embedded in our national culture and our cultural fabric. I don't know what the solutions are. I'm not a, but I do think we need to have a more honest conversation about religious identity and about our values than we have had in this country so far. I'll just leave it at that.
One last question before we conclude. Anyone? Yeah, please.
Mr. Raja, do you think that India is a big market for China? My name is Kapoor. India is a big market for China. Could we not utilize this thing, this facility which we are given to China, what big trade surplus they have in our country, so that we could get their help in prevailing upon Pakistan not to export terror to this country?
Economic relationship is expanding. We hit $60 billion last year. Next 2 years we'll hit 100. Now 3 years down the road it will be $200 billion. So I think the relationship is expanding. What you're saying is that, look, just as the US was not willing to take anything friendly towards India when it came to Pakistan, that changed in the 2000s as the India-US relationship expanded. That is, if the US has bigger stakes in India, so that it has to take a more balanced position between India and Pakistan. Probably China will get there someday, but we're not there yet. So probably somewhere down the road, someday where China might see having $250 billion trade with India is of some value to them. At that point, maybe they'll look at their attitudes towards India and Pakistan differently. But we should try that, whether it works it out or not. But it's worth, and our experience with the US proves it works at least in one case.
Okay, that's the final question. Thank you. I have a very short. Yeah, just could you wait for the mic? Thank you.
No, you've talked of 4 capitals and then you've talked of China. Since historically Russia was associated with this problem in Afghanistan, how does Russia see it presently? Or let's say if China comes in or is thought to be coming in, where is Russian thinking in all this?
No, I think no. About in Russia, when I was after spending a year there, I thought I was a specialist. I could have written a book. After 2 years, I might have written an article, but after 13 years, I don't think I can get a single sentence straight without qualifying myself. So I think I leave this to our 2 expert panelists.
I think very briefly, I think the Russians are playing at many levels. They wouldn't be very unhappy to see the American nose ground into a little bit of dust, having been at the receiving end in the 1980s. But at the same time, they're also helping the Americans. That you have the Northern Distribution Network today as part of the US-Russia reset relationship. US is trying to reduce its dependence on Pakistani territory. So now 40% of the supplies are now coming through the so-called NDN, which comes through Central Asia, Russia. Then Russia is also playing an independent role away from China. Like you saw the summit we had last week in Dushanbe. The Russians have a stake. They want to assert their own influence in Afghanistan without having to be junior partners for the Chinese. So I think the Russians are repositioning themselves. Everyone is going to reposition themselves as the effect of the US withdrawal begins to hit the scene. So, but overall, I would think we need to do a lot more with the Russians again, because they will be a player in one form or another.
Yeah. Praveen, would you like to add something?
No, not except just to say the Russians are very concerned about what's happening in the Caucasus. They have a jihadi threat of their own. They had a terrible bombing not very long ago. Yeah. And I think these are things they're very concerned about. I think the Chinese too are worried. Nobody actually wants this region to go up in flames. And everyone is very, very worried about Pakistan and where it's headed.
Well, thank you. I think it's been, I'm sure I echo your feelings when I thank the two distinguished panelists for their very useful presentations and thought-provoking debate, both on the global basis, not just relating to the United States, but other capitals, including our neighborhood, the implications, and and we have to, and I think we have addressed a very broad range of issues, from the geostrategic, economic, social, and other aspects of the situation. And we'll have to, it's a very, we all agree that after these presentations, that 10 years after 9/11, and I mean, for us, it's an event, of course, of major historical import, but it's not necessarily a turning point, a historical turning point. The events are still unfolding, and I think the general consensus is that while we'll have to work together with the international community, eventually we'll have to get our own act together. And I think Praveen summed this up extremely well, that it's time to stop whining about it and running to mama's apron's strings or something and looking for help and assistance. And whether it's policing, whether it's better intelligence, or essentially a sense of an honest debate, what was suggested by Praveen, I fully share that. I think we are skirting issues, sometimes not being frank enough with each other. I remember here in 1984 when I was here, and I was in external affairs, and I think I did a 72-hour non-stop duty over there, and I used to be carrying tiffin carriers for my staff in big lots, walking up and down Curzon Road and the Secretariat, and what I'll witness was, it's indelible. I agree with Praveen's comments on that. But I asked a friend of mine, a Sikh friend of mine, I asked him, and I knew that he had gone through terrible times. I mean, he had an immediate family member killed. He himself was almost killed. He had a miraculous escape. And apart from other trauma, he lost a lot of property, etc. Asked him, what was your worst experience? What is the worst experience? And he said that his worst experience was when he entered a room and he found some friends conversing, people whom he had known for more than 30 years, 30 or 40 years. And he said there was a sudden split-second silence, a glance at each other, and people were extra polite. And he said it was a slap in the face would have been much better. That was the worst experience. So we need to have an honest debate, and we should look, and what's happening is certainly not, it's true, it is coming from across the border, but a lot of developments are taking place within our own country. We should address these issues, and we just can't keep on repeating these statements. There's some time when we have to say enough is enough. We know that this is a process which is going to go on, but our reaction should be much more. We should not give the impression, of course we are a resilient society. Of course Mumbai and other Delhi is a resilient place. Of course our threshold of tolerances were very high, but it's not endless. There's some time that we should really get, as I said, our own act together, whether it's not just on police and terrorism, a dialogue within our society. And we have done it. We have done it in the past. I refer to 84. Look at what's happening today. And in 84, I can tell you, it is not thanks to the government of India. I was very much in the government at that time, post 84 and thereafter in the Prime Minister's office. And I can tell you very frankly, it was not the success of our intelligence. It was the response of the people in Punjab, because Zia's main focus was not Kashmir. In fact, he regarded them as some, I was impressed by his English, he referred to them as, the lotus eaters. He spoke with contempt. And his goal was Punjab. It was only when Punjab started fizzling away, and thanks to a lot of our acts of commission and omission, that the focus shifted to Jammu and Kashmir. So that's the final conclusion that we come to, I hope. And thank you all for your presence. And let's give a big hand to our two panelists.